I've got a fun one planned for today. We'll be doing a deep dive into the world of spinning reels and baitcasting reels, starting with covering some components of both of them, initial setups, pros and cons, and deciding which one's right for you. And stay tuned and find out on this episode of That Fishing Podcast.
This is Steve Rogers with Steve Rogers Outdoors, and you're listening to That Fishing Podcast. Sit back and enjoy.
Yo, how's it going? Welcome back to the podcast, or if you're new, welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, That Fishing Noob. Thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it. So, a little bit behind the scenes. I had recorded this episode essentially, and then listened to it, and I was like, I'm not feeling it. So now I'm here for part 2 of it, and I changed it up a little bit from my initial recording. So here we are. There's a little glimpse of behind the scenes. Another random thing. This is one of those like, if you know, you know. So there was a new moon yesterday or the day before, and work was not very fun. So new moons, full moons, cold fronts, that makes things a little more complicated, or a lot more complicated. So I'm thankful that this little season has passed, and we'll be getting a just regular moon, so things should be pretty regular at work. If you know, you know. Real quick disclaimer as well. So by no means am I bringing, decades worth of experience to the table. I'm still learning. I'm still working on getting better at this thing called fishing, being a better angler, getting more knowledge. And my intention with this is just to share some information with you to hopefully help you out, especially if you are newer to this thing called fishing. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into it. We'll start with spinning reel components. So with the spinning reel, you have your reel foot. This is like the little 2 feet on your reel that connect onto your spinning rod. You have, of course, your reel handle. This is how you will be retrieving inline, or if it has an anti-reverse switch, then you can go through and let out some line in a controlled fashion. If you got your reel body, which most of the time it'll be graphite or aluminum, if you have an anti-reverse switch, that is typically on the front of your reel. And like I mentioned earlier, some reels that have it, they let you toggle it like on off. So if it's on, then you have no reverse retrieve, no reverse reeling. Whereas if it's off, then you can retrieve, clockwise, and then you can go and retrieve counterclockwise. So clockwise will go through and get some more line onto your spool, and then counterclockwise will let line off of your spool. You've got your bail, and of course, you've got your spool, your drag knob on top of your spool, and then your line roller. So with your bail, this is going to be the primary mechanism of flipping it open to be able to let your line freely come off the spool. You're not going to be able to cast a spinning reel without opening your bail. Your drag knob on top, it's kind of like most things, right? Righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. If you tighten it down, then you are increasing the drag on your reel. And if you loosen it up, then you are decreasing the drag on your reel. So if you don't know what drag is, that is like the amount of weight that needs to be applied onto your line before your spool starts to let line out. So for example, and I've never gone through and weighed my drag. I set it up, and then I will hold the line and then pull it to figure out okay, this is pretty heavy, or this is pretty light, this is too light. So if your drag is too loose on a spinning reel, then whenever you go through and set the hook, you're not going to have a good hook set. You're not going to be able to use the power of your rod because your drag is set too low. So let's say, for example, if it's set to 2 pounds, whenever you set the hook, or you're holding your rod and you're leaning back and you're raising that rod tip up to go and set into hopefully a fish, it's not going to have a lot of power because it's 2 pounds worth of pressure or weight on that line before your spool lets out line. It makes that distinct click, 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 click sound. Whereas if you tighten it down, all the way, let's say for example, if your max drag is like 14 pounds, then when you set into something, you're going to be able to use all of the power of your rod, and your spool is not going to let line out because it's exceeding that poundage. The bad thing about that though is you can break off pretty easily depending on how heavy your line is. The line roller is pretty simple. So in a spinning reel, the spool doesn't rotate. The spool is stationary. You have your line roller that rotates around the spool, and your spool oscillates up and down, and that's what, whenever you're retrieving, gets your line back onto your spool. That line roller or line guide is what is guiding that line back onto your spool. Now next up is a baitcaster reel, or a baitcaster or a casting reel. From this point forward, I'm just going to call it a baitcaster. You have your reel body, you have your line guide, so this is a little bit different because if you're looking at a baitcaster, the primary difference is like how the baitcaster functions, how it operates. So whenever you're casting with a baitcaster, real quick overview, that spool on the baitcaster is what's spinning, which allows the line to come off, versus a spinning reel, where that spool on a spinning reel does not spin, it's stationary, and the line is what's unraveling off of the spool based off of your cast, the weight of your tackle, weight of your lure. So your line guide on a baitcaster is what guides the line back onto the spool. And now line guide is what kind of goes left to the right as you're retrieving to evenly apply that line back onto the spool. You have your handles that you're going to use for retrieving. On a baitcaster, you have a star drag. And the way with this, so if you were to turn the reel sideways, so for reference, I am right-handed, but I fish left-handed. I'm weird. I'm also left eye dominant, but right hand dominant. I'm weird. If you were to turn the baitcaster sideways, it's the same deal, where if you were to rotate or spin it clockwise, that is tightening the drag. If you spin it counterclockwise, that is loosening the drag. So I don't expect you to do that every time whenever you are holding a baitcaster. There's no need. If you're holding the baitcaster, so for me, I hold it in my left hand. My right hand is what is turning the handles. If I need to adjust my drag, I use my index finger to go and tighten my drag, and I'll use my thumb to loosen my drag. Next up, you've got your spool tension knob. That's going to be on the right side of my reels, right side, same side of the handle. This is, as it's been described by Larry Bird III, the gas pedal of a baitcaster. If you tighten it down all the way righty-tighty, then your lure is not going to drop because it's holding the most amount of tension on that spool. Whereas if you loosen it all the way up, then there's not going to be any tension on your spool. You're going to have a lot of left and right play with your spool. And then when you click your thumb bar, which is the next thing, your lure is going to drop really fast, and then you're also going to backlash a lot. So thumb bar is the next thing. This is how to operate a baitcaster, to go through and let it click into free spool mode. This is going to be what you're going to press whenever you are ready to cast. Of course, with reels, you have your spool, and then on a baitcaster, you have your side plate. Typically on your side plate, this is also where you can adjust your braking, your brakes on the reel. And then if you pop that side cover off, there's normally further adjustments. There's normally like little levers that you can go through and flip up, flip down, or there's like little pucks that you can flip up, flip down. Now spinning reels, that line is going to be hanging off of your guides. So whenever you hook onto a fish or anything, that weight is going to be primarily on the guides that are connected to the rod, and then you're going to have your rod bend. On a baitcaster, it's upside down to that. So whenever you're hooking onto hopefully a fish, the pressure, the weight of that line is going to be on the rod versus like just on the guides. Little differences. Real quick before we get into setting these up initially, go over a couple pros and cons. So some pros for a spinning reel, they are really, really beginner friendly. If you've never fished before, a spinning reel will do you solid. There's a smaller learning curve to it. It doesn't require a whole lot of finesse to go through and cast, and it's pretty forgiving. Another pro, spinning reels excel at lighter tackle, which which typically comes with lighter line as well. You're not going to throw let's say a 3/16 ounce something on 25-pound fluorocarbon. Just doesn't make sense. So lighter tackle, lighter line, which is also a lot of your finesse applications. So if you're throwing, let's say 12-pound braid and you have a 6-pound fluorocarbon leader and you're working like a hyper finesse drop shot that excels on a spinning reel. Another pro with the spinning reel is you don't need to make adjustments whenever you change the weight of your lures. You can cast out something that is crazy heavy or crazy light. There's no micro adjustments. There's no other adjustments to make. It's just tying on whatever that new thing is and making casts. Some cons of a spinning reel is typically they're heavier whenever you can still fish heavier line with spinning reels, but the trade-off is you're going to have to increase that spool size. So like 2,500, 3,000 spool size is, pretty average. But if you wanted to start fishing like really heavy stuff or bigger fish, you're going to have to get into that 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 and then up. And this is typically for any kind of like offshore stuff. Or if you're going and, trying to wrestle in like really big blues, really big catfish. Some cons of a spinning reel too is you have less accuracy of cast. Now, I'm going to juxtapose that to a bait caster. So whenever you are casting a spinning reel, it's going through rotating your line guide close to the rod. You're going to hook the line with your index finger, open your bail, going to go through and, do a backswing, flick your rod forward at the same time, letting go of the line with your index finger or your trigger finger. Then that lure is casted out, whee, bloop, lands in the water. There's not a whole lot of input that you have. Like you can't control the breaks of it, so to speak. And I'll get into that when I get into the bait casters. It's like you are as accurate as you are flicking or whipping that rod with a spinning reel. You can like cut it short, but you can't feather it really. Like there's less feathering that you can do compared to a bait caster. And then also casting distance is going to be a little bit less than a bait caster. So moving on to a bait caster, some of the pros are you can go through and work heavier line, heavier lures. And if you think bass fishing, like just stereotypical bass fishing, and this isn't really a pro, but like bait casters are the face of bass fishing. Like I mentioned with spinning reels and accuracy of casts, bait casters allow for more accurate casts because you can feather your spool when you're casting. So typically when you're casting a bait caster, you click your thumb bar, and instead of it's not a whipping motion, it's like a sweeping motion almost. At least that's what makes sense in my head, and that's what helped me really go through and like stop backlashing so much. But after that like sweeping motion instead of like a really hard whipping motion, that thumb, in my case my left thumb, is what is close to or just barely touching my spool, because I'm feathering out like how fast my spool is spinning, so that way it doesn't overspin or spin too fast compared to how much line's coming off, which creates a backlash. Now the fun thing with this is if I'm trying to cast right next to let's say a laydown, a specific part of a laydown, after I go through and cast, I can feather my spool so I can go through and make that more accurate cast. If it's going too far, I can go through and apply more brakes or more pressure with my thumb to slow down my lure. And then right when it's like right where I want it, I can go through and just put all the pressure down on my thumb, and then click my thumb bar close with my handles. So there's more finesse or more like tighter, accurate casting with a bait caster compared to a spinning reel. You can still feather a spinning reel, but it's not as precise as with a bait caster. With the bait caster, you can also get some really, really good distance out of these lures, especially when you have it dialed in and you're familiar enough with it that your brakes that are on your side plate are set to like 2. You can get phenomenal casting distances for like very little effort, which is wild. Some of the cons of a bait caster, I think the biggest thing is going to be a very steep learning curve initially. And if you're not patient and you're starting off, it can be the most infuriating thing ever whenever you are like, all right, cool. I've got a brand new reel. I'm going out. I'm going to fish with it. Going to properly break it in, hopefully catch some fish. You go through your first cast, your reel just creates this gigantic nest and knot and mess of line, aka a backlash. Now, typically the process of going through and like fixing a backlash is clicking your thumb bar and then pulling out line with your, so like in my case, I would click the thumb bar with my left thumb, and then with my right hand, I would pull line manually off of my spool until I get it all the way out and I get back to my line is evenly laying over my spool. Now this can take anywhere from, like 5 seconds because it was a very small backlash to like 30 minutes, and it's like it doesn't even make sense to go through and like try to save this line because it's that bad. So the learning curve with a baitcaster can be pretty steep, especially if you don't have someone there helping you out, or at least initially helping you set up your reel. Another con with baitcasters is whenever you change up your lure, you are going to have to change up your tension knob, make adjustments to your tension knob. Otherwise, you might backlash a lot, especially if you're making a big weight jump. So if you're throwing out, like, let's say a Senko that's weightless and then you're going to tie on an A-rig, you have to adjust your tension knob accordingly, otherwise you're going to backlash. Now, fret not, I have some tips for you to go through and set up your baitcaster to hopefully keep you fishing more and backlashing less. But before that, let's go through a general setup of a spinning reel. Typically, if you buy a spinning reel from, a big box store, if it's like Bass Pro Shop, Academy, Cabela's, whatever you have near you, they should offer, at least they do down here in Texas, they offer to put on line for you. It's not going to be the best line, but if you're brand new and you went down and looked at the fishing line, you're like, oh my goodness, there's like hundreds upon hundreds of boxes. I don't know what to do. Then having that store go through and spool up your reel with like 14-pound monofilament is not a bad deal at all. If you didn't opt for that and you are going home and you bought yourself some line and you're going to spool it up yourself, the way that I do it is I will lay my spool down on the ground, my spool of line, and I will have it unwinding at like the same rotation direction as my reel if I was going through and like retrieving in line. So for example, I'm retrieving in line, it is clockwise. Then my spool of line on the ground, when the line is coming off, it's going to be clockwise, especially with line that has more memory. So like monofilament has a lot of memory. A lot of copolymers have a crazy amount of memory. The other way around this is you could go through and put your spool of line, you can put your line into some hot water. That way it kind of erases that memory and allows for it to take the form of your reel. But after that, so after I have my line on the ground, same direction as my spool, I will go through and feed one guide up off of my rod, and then I will tie off onto my reel. And then when I am retrieving, I like to hold my line. So again, I'm left-handed, or I fish left-handed. I'm retrieving in with my right hand. I'm turning the handle with my right hand, and in my left hand, I'm applying a little bit of pressure, a little bit of tension, and holding that line as I am retrieving, as I am going through and rotating that handle to get line onto my spool. Also, my drag is not completely loose. If it was completely loose, then I would not be able to retrieve line onto my spool because the drag would be going through and being like, hey, there's too much weight. So we're just going to, it's not going to have tension. It's not going to be able to keep tension. But after that, big thing that I had to learn early too is not over spooling my spool. So I will go through and spool up until I am, let's say, maybe a centimeter, or we'll go millimeters, maybe 2 millimeters away from, or 1 millimeter away from the lip, the end of my spool. And then after that, I'll just go through and thread. Like after I cut my line, I will thread the tag in through the rest of the guides, making sure that it goes through the center of the guide and not the supports of the guide. And then once I'm at the top, loop it back down, tie on whatever I'm going to throw, and good to go. Bada bing, bada boom. Now, whenever I'm going out and fishing with it, it's a really, really easy going learning curve. It's essentially going through and making sure my lure is approximately, like, this is just a generalization, 6 inches away from that top guide, go through and rotate around my line so that way the guide, my line guide is, or line roller is close to my rod. With my left index finger, I am holding that line, that's my trigger finger, opening up the bail, doing a back cast or back swing, and then flicking it or whipping it forward, letting go of the line with my index finger, and then closing my bail with my right hand before my lure hits the water or just after my lure hits the water. It's a good habit to have. This could be one of those things, especially if you come close to over spooling your reel. If you don't do that and there's a bunch of slack now, you could get these coils of line coming off your spool, it can lead to a bird nest, which is not fun. And then there you go. That's your first cast. Little quick tip for casting a spinning reel. It's a big timing game. So if you're, making your back cast and you're casting and your lure is going straight up in the air, you are releasing your finger way too early. If you're doing your back cast, you cast, and that lure goes like straight down into the ground, you're releasing your finger too late. So it's all a big timing game. Now, your initial setup with a bait caster, this is going to be a lot more complicated, but this is how I have set up my brand new bait casters, and I have been good. So a little bit of backstory real quick, side topic, sort of on topic. I had been fishing with spinning reels for the longest time, and I was never interested in getting into bait casters at all. Way back before, especially when I first started kayak fishing, I just had 2 spinning reels, no bait casters. And then my buddy Mike over at Saved by Grace Outdoors, he was like, hey, you should get into fishing bait casters. They're awesome, especially because you like bass fishing. Bait casters, bass fishing, that's a winning combination. You should do it. And I was like, nope. I'm content with my spinning reels. And then one day, my buddy brought out a random bait caster. And it was funny because I actually set it up as far as getting the knots out and then making sure the line was sitting on the spool correctly and all that stuff. And then I went fishing with it and I was like, oh my goodness, what is this sensation? This is phenomenal. This is great. What have I been missing out on? And then from that point forward, I was like, all right, well, now I need to go get a bait caster. So my very first bait caster was a Bass Pro Shop Extreme, and that was a traditional bait caster. And I say traditional compared to anything with the DC technology. DC technology makes casting a bait caster crazy easy. So I had my Bass Pro Shop Extreme bait caster, and I backlashed a ton. A lot. And this is after I watched videos, and I was like, all right, cool. I'm setting up my tension knob correctly, and I'm setting up my, brakes correctly. And I was still backlashing, especially getting used to thumbing my spool, and then that finesse closing, putting pressure on my spool before my lure hits the water, so that way it doesn't go over spool. I backlashed a lot. So that leading into, this is how I currently set up any of my new bait casters, and it's been good for me. Now, you can tweak it a little bit because, like I mentioned at the beginning, I'm a noob. I'm still learning. So you can tweak this a little bit. This is not the 100%. This is the way to do it. This is the way that I do it, and hopefully will help you go through and fish more and backlash less. So when I have a bait caster fresh out of the box, after I've gone through and thrown on whatever line I'm going to be fishing with, and all of my bait casters have some kind of fluorocarbon, either FC Sniper, ranging from I think 12 to 17 pounds, to I have some Red Label, and then some Invisix, same thing, ranging from 12 to 16-ish. I think I might have a couple with 20 pound. So to anyone starting out, I recommend that you increase your brakes all the way up to 10, 9, 8, higher brakes. And then the good thing about setting up a bait caster, you don't need water to set it up. You just need space to make a cast. So front yard, backyard, anywhere that you have adequate space to make a 30 yard, 20 yard cast. Or it doesn't even need to be that. It could be 10 yards if you are not trying to make a full cast. So brakes set pretty high. Like I said, 10, 9, 8 in that upper realm. And then tension knob, I want you to tighten it down to where when you click your thumb bar, whatever you have tied on does not drop when you're holding your rod at a 45 or a little bit less than that degree angle. You click your thumb bar, that does not drop anywhere. Your lure does not drop. So what you're going to do is thumb bar is pressed, your spool is in free spool. You're not going to thumb your spool, you're not going to touch your spool. Only thing you're worrying about right now, with your rod at a 30 degree angle, 45 degree angle, you will slowly loosen up that tension knob until you see your lure start to fall very evenly and very smoothly and slowly. So what you're looking for is a very gradual and consistent and slow drop rate. That is going to be a phenomenal spot for you to be whenever you're making these first casts. Now, with these settings, you are not going to be getting crazy casting distances. However, you are utilizing the brakes of your reel to compensate for you building the muscle memory of being able to brake with your thumb or thumb your spool. So once you have this set up, go ahead and start making some casts. Biggest thing that you want to get used to, so once you click your thumb bar, make your backswing, make a cast. Like I mentioned earlier too, the thing that helped me out a lot is with spinning reels, I describe my cast as a big whip. It's like going through baitcast and then, getting that initial bend and then whipping my rod forward, like a really snappy whip. I found that whenever I was trying to cast my baitcaster or that setup like a spinning setup, that's when I got into trouble, especially when I started lowering down my brakes, because then off of that initial cast, my spool is spinning crazy fast because I'm whipping the heck out of the rod. With a baitcaster, you don't need muscle to go through and get your lures to fly far. It's not one of those the harder you throw it, the farther it's going to go. It's really how you have your reel set up. So the way my brain works is it's more of a sweeping motion. You can have a little bit of a flick, but it's not as intense as a whip with a spinning rod setup. So with that, make some casts, have that sweeping motion, and then you need to get down the muscle memory of pressing down onto your spool with your thumb before your lure hits the ground. This will prevent a lot of overspooling and thus a lot of backlashes. So we're just going to go through repetition. Go through, make a cast, make sure that you thumb your spool, or you make it you use your thumb, hover it over the spool, and just feel that sensation of your spool is spinning. And you can play with the pressure. Obviously, the more pressure, that's equivalent to more braking, so that's less distance. Less pressure means that that spool is able to freely spin independently, which equals more distance, but then there's opportunity for backlash if you're not careful with going through and pressing down onto your spool before your lure hits the water. So do that, repetition, rep it out. Now, for some reason, if you do backlash, no worries. Here's how I pick out a backlash. You go through, click your thumb bar. So in my case, left hand, left thumb, presses thumb bar. And then right hand, I am holding line, peeling it off of my spool. And with my left hand, I am still thumbing my spool. So that way, if you don't do that, and then if I were to go through, or you were to go through and just yank line, your spool is going to overspool. There's going to be excess line that's coming off, and then you're just going to create more of a backlash. Keeping pressure on your spool while you're going through and pulling line off, and you're going to want to keep pulling line until you get to the point where that line is back where it's evenly wound across your spool. And then after that, then what I do is I will then put my rod under my arm, and then my left hand, I will hold my line above the guide, and then my right hand start retrieving in my line. Now, I'm not putting a crazy amount of pressure on the line or crazy amount of tension on the line when I'm reapplying it, respooling it back onto, or rewinding it back onto my reel. It's enough pressure, enough tension that it's not like a slack line. Let's say, for example, you made a cast and you're trying to pull out your backlash, and then it gets to a point where there's a knot, or you get to a point where you're pulling and then you can't pull any further because the line is like wrapped over itself and it's digging into your spool. Here's 2 ways that you can go through and work that out. So if you were to look down where your line is supposed to be going back around the spool, you'll see a little loop that is going over that line, and that's what's causing it to get hung up. With your nails, you can go through and pick that loop, pull it up, and then keep pulling it out until you get to the point where your spool is able to go through and like it's free. You can go through and rewind and get line back on. Now, for example, if it's like bad and like you can't pull it out and it's stuck, then a trick that I do is I will tighten down my drag all the way, and then I will put a ton of pressure on my spool, and I will wind my handles, and then after, let's say 4 or 5 winds, I'll go through, repeat that process. Click thumb bar, pull line off while thumbing my spool and seeing if, okay, cool. It's either it's fixed or it's not fixed, and I'll repeat that process 2-3 times. What I'm trying to do, it's kind of like the same method. It's going through and catching that little crimp, that line that's wrapped around the portion of line that I'm trying to reapply onto my spool, and allowing it to unwind out of that. Like, what's essentially happening is that little portion of line is wound around that spool like 3, 4, 5 times, and then it's creating that tension, that little crimp, that little pinch. So the intention with it is drag all the way down. While I'm going through and retrieving in line, I'm moving that little crimped portion like back and getting it out. But then after that, the fun thing with a baitcaster is you can go through and make micro adjustments. So if you're comfortable with those settings and you're not backlashing anymore and you actually made it out to water and you're fishing, if you want more distance, you decrease your brakes. So let's say your brakes are set at, 8. I would not recommend you go from 8 to like 2. You could, but you run the risk of backlashing. I would say, go from 8 to maybe 7, 8 to 7.5, 8 to 6.5. And then it's all trial and error, going through and making a cast and seeing like, okay, cool, this is what it feels like, or having that muscle memory of, okay, I need to thumb my spool more whenever I have my brake set around this. And then also with the tension knob, you can make adjustments with that as well. It doesn't need to be like this crazy, it falls, let's say a foot a second. You can go through and have it have a pretty rapid, fall rate. But the thing with that, the thing to keep in mind is you need to go through and thumb your spool more. You need to go through and compensate for that extra fall rate, because if you don't, then your spool can overspool. That leads to backlashes, leads to not a very fun time. And then with both a spinning reel or a baitcaster, I work my drag the same way. So on a spinning reel, like I will go through and tighten down my drag. I will, with my right hand, I will pull up on my line, and then I feel like engaged, like, okay, that feels pretty heavy. That's, I don't know, like I can't even lie to you and be like, this is about 6 pounds of drag. This is about 8 pounds of drag, because I've never measured it, so I don't know. I just have it's one of those like trial by error. I was like, all right, cool, this feels heavy enough. And there have been times when, like before, when I was like, this is heavy enough, and then I hook into something and I'm like, this is not heavy enough. I need to go through and tighten my drag. Which, with the spinning reel, kind of difficult, because especially like if that fish is running at me, the only way to tighten drag on a spinning reel is taking your hand off of the handle, tightening drag, and then going through, getting your hand back on the handle and retrieving it. On a baitcaster, same thing. I will go through and my thumb bar is not depressed. It is not in free spool. I'm grabbing my line with my right hand and I'm pulling and seeing like, okay, cool, this feels heavy, this doesn't feel heavy, and then making adjustments accordingly. Fun thing with adjusting drag on a baitcaster is you can do it on the fly, because while you're your right hand on, well, in my case, my right hand on my handles, I can go through an index finger, go through tighten drag, or thumb, decrease drag, while my hand is still on my handles. So all that leads to the big question of which reel is the right one for you. Now that all depends. I've got a couple questions for you. What kind of fishing are you planning on doing? What kind of species are you planning on catching? Are you primarily going to be targeting bass, whether it be, black bass, warmouths, spots, smallmouth bass, Guadalupe bass, depending on where you are? Or are you planning on targeting multiple species? So crappie to, like, if you have snook around you, catfish, taking that and like inshore fishing and going and chasing specks, reds, flounder, sheep's head. Are you planning on doing just like sunfish stuff where you're going out and fishing for little bluegill? What kind of fishing are you planning on doing? So if you're a beginner, then I would highly recommend that you get a spinning reel. Like I mentioned, it is like super noob friendly. It is very forgiving. There is not a steep learning curve. If you're not really set on fishing for one particular species because you're kind of getting into fishing and you're like, oh, I don't even know if like I'm going to stick with it, just the sound of it is nice, then yeah, for sure, a spinning rod. Because you don't have to make adjustments in between what you're throwing out, whether it be like live bait or worms, or let's say you're throwing artificial soft plastics, or let's say like crankbaits, spinner baits, or even like cut bait. There are no adjustments that you need to make in between casting any of those things with a spinning reel. Versus if you wanted to do that with a bait caster, you're going to have to make those adjustments, which doesn't take a whole lot of time, but it's one of those like extra steps that you will need to make whenever switching up what you're throwing. If you're a beginner and you really want to get into bass fishing and you are especially patient, then a bait caster might be good for you. There's just something about bait casters that they have a particular charm. I didn't think I was going to enjoy fishing with them. Now, most of my rods are bait casters. I don't have the craziest collection. I have 3 spinning reels and 6... no. Let's go up. I have 4 spinning reels now and 6 bait casters. And I fished with, like I mentioned, my very first bait caster was a Bass Pro Shop, a traditional bait caster. I think centrifugal brakes on it. And then after that, I got a Shimano SLX DC. DC technology makes bait casting like crazy easy. It takes a lot of the random, like the guesswork out. It is dialed in. It makes bait casting, like fishing with the bait caster, super, super simple. But they're also really expensive. And then now, majority of my reels now are Lew's, ranging from a Lew's Speed Spool to a couple of Tournament Pros, a BB1 Pro, and that. And then I have one Kistler Chromium that I got for free. As complicated as bait casters are, don't let that shy you away. Don't let that scare you away from going through and buying one if that's the route that you want to go. Especially if you want to get like primarily into bass fishing. If you have it in your budget and like this isn't even crazy, like $500, you can go through, and my last spinning reel that I got was a Daiwa Laguna. And I actually have that paired on a really funny rod that I still need to edit the footage for. But like Daiwa Laguna, it was like $25 rod, or sorry, $25 reel. That thing is like great. It's like a 3-ball bearing. That reel so far has been great. I've had some issues with my drag, with having to go through and like constantly adjust it and retighten it, but that might have just been me. I need to look into it. But you don't need to spend a fortune to go through and like get these reels. So if it's within your budget and you're feeling up to it, feeling up for a challenge, or feeling just adventurous, go through and buy one of both. My recommendation, not that it counts for a whole lot because like I said, I'm a noob. I don't have, decades worth or a crazy amount of bass fishing or fishing in general under my belt. But a recommendation that I have is getting a Lew's Speed Spool, especially now because they have their Gen 3s out and it's still at the same $99 price point. That is a phenomenal baitcaster out of the box. Outside of that, in the spinning world, so a little bit more expensive than $99, but I love these reels. I have some Daiwa BGs, and they are great. Like, I love those reels. But yeah, do some research. It really heavily depends on what type of fishing or what species that you're wanting to target as well. It's multi-species, especially like going from fresh to salt as well. A spinning reel will do you solid. And like, I'd say a 3,000 size spinning reel would do you solid. If you're primarily wanting to get into bass fishing and get into like the bass fishing tournament scene and go catch, PBs, 10-pound bass, 7-pound bass, all the good things, then a baitcaster will be phenomenal. It will be a ton of fun after you initially get that set up and then work on the muscle memory of thumbing your spool, feathering your spool. Baitcaster is great. But that's not to say, too, if you want to primarily stick with bass fishing, that a spinning reel will not be sufficient. I fished with spinning reels and fished for bass for like 2 years. If you have the opportunity also to go into a store and hold some of these reels, I think that'll make a big difference too, because you might have done some research online and you've narrowed it down to like top 3. Go into a store and get it in your hand and get a feeling for it, because you might think like, oh, this is actually a really nice reel, and then you go into the store and you're like, oh, this is actually like really heavy, or you don't like how the bail engages or opens and closes, or you don't like how the drag feels. There might be something that you would otherwise miss if you didn't get your hands on it. And then same thing for a baitcaster. Get your hands on it. For me, I like a smaller profile. So I like smaller profile spinning and casting spools or sizes. For example, I really enjoy my Lew's Tournament Pro. I think it's a great, condensed, smaller profile little baitcaster. I had read amazing reviews for Daiwa Tatulas, but when I went into the store and held one, I was like, man, this feels not significantly more bulky, but it feels more bulky than my Lew's. My Lew's just felt better in hand for me compared to that Tatula. Like, I had in hand, I was just like, I could fish with it. And it's not like the ergonomics on it aren't horrible. It's not a horrible reel. It's just not as comfortable in my hands than my Lew's. So that's why most of my reels are Lew's. So I encourage you to go through, get into a store, like go do research online and be like, all right, so these are my top 3 spinning if you want to get into spinning, or these are my top 3 bait casting if you want to get into that. Or like pull both up, but then go into a store, get them in hand and be like, all right, this is how it feels. This is what it feels like to go through and like retrieve it. This is what it feels like to, press in that thumb bar or open up that bail, because it might change your mind. This episode's coming to a close. Hopefully this information will help you either make a choice about which one to get, which reel to get, or if you've already done that, hopefully, some part of it will help out either the setup or the fishing or some of the information. My goal, like I mentioned earlier, is to help you guys out, provide some value. But thank you for spending your time with me. I appreciate that. Some random person that started a random podcast. If you're choosing to spend your time with me, thank you. I greatly appreciate that. I would also appreciate it if you were to leave me a star rating on Spotify or wherever you're listening to. So if you can go through and boost that up. When I first started my podcast, it was not populating like anywhere close to anything. But now it's actually like pretty high up or higher up on the search results than before, which is understandable, right? Brand new podcast, like people aren't going to know and it's not going to populate. But then also, if you could leave me some feedback, I would appreciate that as well. I'm very open to feedback. I don't have this thing dialed in. I'm no Andrew Hayes, like none of that. So any help or constructive criticism or anything like that, I would appreciate. I do want to make this into something that is beneficial and good, and like essentially a big library of information or, entertaining interviews and talks, but ultimately like a bunch of wisdom to go through and give back. My YouTube channel wouldn't be where it is right now without help and assistance and, my subscribers going through and tuning in and watching and like sharing these experiences with me. So it's kind of like the same thing with this podcast that I'm trying to build. I know that it's not going to get to where it will if it was just me. Like, I need help and I appreciate the help. But with that, guys, thank you again. I hope that you are able to go fishing. And if you are fishing, I hope that you're able to catch a big one. But I'll catch you on the next one. Tight lines, and God bless.